Burying your pain doesn't make it disappear, it just turns it into a silent monster that eats you from the inside out. Toxic positivity is the poison of this generation. Watch until the end to embrace your abyss. 3 days after the funeral, she laughed at something stupid on TV and hated herself for it instantly. That laugh wasn't a betrayal, it wasn't proof she loved him less or that the grief wasn't real. Here's the thing nobody tells you about loss. It doesn't move in one straight gray line. It comes in weather. A morning of nothing, an afternoon where the sun through the kitchen window feels almost obscene in how good it is, then a night that folds back into the dark like it never left. And under all of it, the laugh, the ache, the strange peace that shows up uninvited at a funeral, there's an old shape trying to tell her something the culture never taught her to hear. Here's how we usually talk about it. Good days and bad days, strong emotions and weak ones, productive hours and wasted ones. We built an entire cultural vocabulary that treats half of the human experience like a virus, a glitch in the software, something to isolate, medicate, or shame out of a person until they function like a well-oiled machine. Walk into any bookstore, ask any self-help shelf what to do with fear, boredom, rage, or silence. The answer is almost universally identical, wrapped in different, brightly colored packaging. Kill it? Optimize it out. Replace it with something shinier, something more palatable for a society that demands constant, unending performance. We have industrialized the human soul, turning natural fluctuations of mood into pathologies that need to be cured. Look around you. That system doesn't just fail sometimes. It fails by design. It is fundamentally built on one catastrophic false idea: the delusion that the bad stuff is completely separate from the good stuff. It sells you the lie that you can take a scalpel to your own psyche and cut out the grief, the anger, the melancholy, clean like a tumor, leaving only a perpetually smiling husk behind. You can't. And every place that has tried, every extreme diet, every rigid discipline, every sterile decade spent teaching children that their anger and sadness are merely problems to be fixed, leaves behind a trail of destruction. It creates populations of people who are infinitely more anxious, more chemically numb, or more violently explosive than the ones who never tried to sanitize themselves at all. Once you see how this actually works, the curtain is pulled back. You are not going to be able to unsee the machinery. And more importantly, you're not going to be able to wage war against your own moods in the same destructive way ever again. Start with something undeniable, something nobody can argue with, because your own physical eyes prove it every single day. You cannot see light without the darkness wrapping around it. I'm not speaking poetically, I'm speaking literally. A star only shows up because the sky behind it is an infinite, crushing black. A candle burning in a brightly lit room does absolutely nothing. It is a redundant flicker. But that exact same candle, struck in the middle of a total blackout, is a beacon. It can save a life. It dictates direction. Your eye, your brain, your entire central nervous system was engineered by millions of years of brutal evolution to register difference, not absolutes. Total light, if you stare into it long enough, eventually reads to the brain as a blank white room. It becomes a new kind of blindness. Total silence, absolute anechoic silence doesn't bring peace, it brings madness, making you hear the terrifying rush of your own blood pumping through your veins until it becomes deafening. Total anything, if held long enough, stops registering as anything at all. It becomes the baseline. It becomes nothing. This isn't a mood. This isn't a philosophical theory or a depressive episode. That is biology. That is the cold, hard architecture of your flesh. There's an old name for this concept, thousands of years old, which has been tragically stripped of its teeth and usually misread as some soft, new age spiritual decoration. Yin and yang, forget the cheap tattoos and the commercialized mindfulness. What it is actually describing is closer to a brutal, unyielding grammar of reality. It is a set of working rules underneath the floorboards of our lives. The contrast rule, the seed rule, the wobble rule, and the shadow rule. Call it the Taiji code if you need a structural name for it. It is not mysticism. It is pure, ruthless mechanism. Here is the ugly way to test this framework. Take the absolute worst impulse inside a human being. Visceral rage, self-destructive addiction, the one cruel, jagged thing you said to someone you love that can never be unsaid. And ask what it is actually doing there. Do not ask whether it is bad or evil. Ask what its function is. Because a psychological system that only explains your good days, your victories, and your sanitized mornings is a toy, a child's blanket. A real framework has to survive contact with the darkest, most terrifying parts of you, the parts that never make it into the social media highlight reel. Rule 1. Contrast. Nothing means anything alone. A soldier who has only ever known the high-stakes adrenaline of combat cannot recognize peace when he finally arrives home. It doesn't register. He sits in a quiet living room, but his eyes keep scanning the doors. His heart rate elevates at the sound of a dropping plate, searching for a threat that isn't there anymore. His entire nervous system was heavily calibrated against absolute danger, and when the danger is removed, the peace feels like an ambush. Rule 2. The seed. Every extreme state carries the exact starting point of its opposite, buried deep inside of it, like a microscopic crack already forming in a pane of bulletproof glass the very day it is installed. Endless, grinding productivity eventually, inevitably forces total exhaustion. The burnout, the crash, the morning you physically cannot get out of bed. That isn't a malfunction of your willpower. It is the seed doing its job. It is nature forcing the pendulum back. Rule 3. The wobble. Balance was never a still photograph. It is not a state of Zen meditation on a mountain. Watch anyone ride a bicycle. They are not frozen magically upright. They are falling. They are correcting constantly, engaging in tiny, violent falls to the left and tiny, violent falls to the right 1,000 times a minute. To look at that chaotic, desperate physical correction and call it standing still is a fundamental lie. Balance is just managed chaos. Rule 4. The shadow. This is the one Carl Jung spent his entire life charting, staring into the abyss of the human psyche. He argued, in blunt, clinical terms, that whatever we refuse to look at in ourselves does not simply disappear. It doesn't evaporate because you ignored it. It goes to the basement, it waits, it ferments, and eventually it comes out sideways, usually manifesting as something far worse, far more destructive than where we originally buried it. Now watch the architecture crumble when these rules start stacking on top of one another. Take contrast plus shadow. We live in a culture that exclusively rewards unyielding toughness, a society that actively punishes tears, that views rest as a weakness, that treats doubt as a lack of faith. But burying these things doesn't get rid of softness or vulnerability, it just violently exports it. It redirects it into secret alcoholism, into quiet burnout, and into generations of stoic men who cannot put a name to what they are feeling until it is already a fatal heart attack or a late-night crisis. They optimize the weakness out and the shadow consume them whole. Look at the seed plus the wobble. Consider a massive corporation on an unbroken 10-year growth streak. Investors applaud. But the seed of the crash is already being carried inside that very expansion. The entities that actually survive over decades aren't the ones that arrogantly believe they can dodge the dip. They are the ones that intentionally build a wobble into their system. They leave room for a bad quarter, they build in slack, they accept the absolute necessity of the fall. And then observe the deadliest combination, contrast plus wobble plus shadow, all three at once. This is the outlier case. This is the man who looks perfectly calm, perfectly put together on the outside for 20 long years and then implodes overnight, destroying his family, his career, his life. Everyone stands around the wreckage and calls it sudden. It was never sudden. It was the seed, growing quietly and patiently in the dark, inside a rigid system that had absolutely no wobble built in. And a shadow that nobody was ever allowed to name. You don't have to take this framework on faith either. Long before Jung put a sterilized clinical label on it, the ancient texts were saying the exact same brutal truth. Lao Tzu wrote that the very second we define and name something as beautiful, we have simultaneously, in that exact same breath, created the category of ugly. You cannot have one without giving birth to the other. Modern psychology violently backs this up. Empirical research on emotional suppression consistently finds that the individuals who try the absolute hardest to shut a negative feeling down report significantly higher levels of severe distress later on. It is not one philosopher's ancient opinion, it is a mathematical pattern that keeps showing up whenever anyone is brave enough to actually measure it. I will give you my own failure. For years, I treated rest like a moral failing. Every single hour I spent not producing something, not moving forward, not grinding, felt like absolute proof that I was lazy, worthless, falling behind. And I punished myself for it with more work. That was just the contrast rule running completely unsupervised and feral inside my own head. Work equals good, stillness equals bad, and there was absolutely zero room for anything in between. It took a genuinely stupid, terrifying physical crash, the kind where your biological machinery just pulls the plug and your body physically stops answering your commands, to teach me the truth. Stillness was never the enemy. It was just the other half of the exact same system, and it had been silently collecting a massive debt the entire time. I bankrupt myself trying to outrun my own biology. So if you have spent years feeling fundamentally broken, staring at the ceiling at 3 a.m. because you cannot just think positive and hold it forever, understand this right now. That was never a character flaw. That is a biological system fighting its own inescapable wiring. Every self-help method, every guru, every modern philosophy that asks you to surgically delete half of yourself will eventually, inevitably, lose to the half it tried to erase. Because that is not how a nervous system is built. That is not how a culture operates, and that is not how a universe built on the brutal friction of contrast is put together. Stop keeping a ruthless score against yourself for having a bad, empty week right after a highly productive month. Stop treating the tired, foggy, depressive, low-energy version of you as an imposter, and the sharp, hyper-motivated, aggressive version as the real you. They are both real. They are both load-bearing pillars of your psyche. The old system, the one that told you to clinically isolate the good and violently burn out the bad, was a fairy tale. It was never going to work, and now you know exactly why. You are not broken, you're not malfunctioning, you're just finally learning to read the dark, unforgiving grammar you were always speaking.